Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to take a long, slow walk into a village that officially should not exist anymore. Imagine this: a tiny settlement once nestled at the base of a volcanic ridge, homes built of stone fields dotted with maize, and goat smoke from kitchens curling into the crisp mountain air. And then silence. A volcanic eruption comes, ash rains down, and what should remain is a scene of tragedy: scorched earth, petrified bodies, lives frozen in time. That's what Pompeii gave us, right? Charred skeletons locked in their final breath. But in this case, when the ashes finally settled and modern archaeologists began their excavation, centuries later, they didn't find the bodies. Not a single one. A murder mystery has occurred, but on a scale so large it almost bends belief. A whole town gone, leaving behind their homes, their tools, their meals, their lives, but not themselves. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And hey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you do, because you never know. You might just find a neighbor listening along right next to you. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The excavation began in 1997 when a team of Peruvian archaeologists was charting the slopes of the dormant volcano Cerro Blanco. They weren't expecting to find much, maybe some pottery shards, maybe an abandoned farming terrace. What they found instead was what looked like the roof of a stone house poking through the hardened ash layer. Carefully, they brushed away the dust. The house was intact walls, still standing a cooking pot, balanced neatly on a hearth. And here's the part that stopped them cold: inside the pot was food. Grain stew carbonized, but recognizable, still clinging to the ceramic walls. Someone had been making dinner the moment the volcano rumbled, but there were no bodies. Normally, volcanic disasters leave evidence of victim skeletons, impressions in the ash, at least fragments of human remains. But as the archaeologists expanded the digs, uncovering 3, then 5, then a dozen homes, it was the same pattern: meals, half prepared, tools laid out mid task, a spindle with unfinished thread, even a pair of sandals neatly set beside a bed. It was as if the people had simply stood up and walked away, never to return. One of the archaeologists later said, "It was like entering a stage set after the actors had gone home." And here's a strange detail: among the unearthed artifacts, they found a clay whistle still lodged in a child's toy basket. When one of the workers idly blew into it, it gave off an eerie bird-like cry that echoed against the volcano's cliffs. The sound was unsettling enough that they stopped playing with it, but it made its way into the early field reports. The absence of remains quickly sparked debates. Were the villagers warned in advance? Did they evacuate en masse? But if so, why leave their food, cooking, their clothes spread on the line, their lives in mid motion? Investigators and historians are still debating whether the eruption was sudden or whether something else happened that pulled every inhabitant out of their homes at the same time. The official site report called the place Pueblo de Cenizas, the town of ashes, but the locals whispering about the discovery in the nearby villages had another name for it: El Pueblo Hueco, the hollow town, because something about the emptiness didn't sit right. Remember crocodile poop sunscreen from part 3 of our last case? This detail had a similar weird energy. It didn't explain anything, but it was just off enough to crawl under your skin. And here's the hook that still keeps me awake sometimes: deep in the ash, on the western wall of what had been the town's communal storehouse, they found a carving. It wasn't decorative, and it wasn't part of the building's original design. It looked rushed, gouged in with a sharp stone just before the ash fell. 4 symbols repeating across the wall. Nobody could translate them with certainty, but one epigrapher swore they resembled a phrase common in ancient Andean oral tradition: "We will return." The first days of excavation had been a triumph, but by the second week, the air around the site had shifted. What began as scientific excitement slowly turned into a hush of unease. The archaeologists were trained to expect bones, to expect tragedy, to expect the silent evidence of death, but this town gave them none of that. Instead, it offered them an illusion, life frozen mid gesture. In one house, a loom stood with bright threads stretched across it, the weaving half finished, the shuttle lying neatly on the floor. In another, a set of clay bowls rested on a table filled with maize kernels. The bowls weren't toppled, weren't covered in debris, they were still waiting to be eaten from. And then came the most unsettling discovery yet. In the town's central plaza, beneath layers of ash and pumice, they uncovered what looked like the preparation for a festival. Colorful banners, faded now, but still recognizable, in the volcanic cement, had been strung between poles. Musical instruments, flutes, drums, and conch shells were scattered across the square. A pile of maize beer jars, sealed with resin, had been stacked as though for celebration, but again, no people. Archaeologists began to whisper among themselves that the villagers had been warned and fled, but that didn't explain why the artifacts were left in perfect order. Evacuations are chaotic.
People grab what they can. They flee with their children, their valuables, their food. Here it was as though the entire town had politely stood up at the same moment, left their things untouched, and filed silently into the night. A historical fact worth noting here: in Andean cultures, festivals often coincided with celestial events, solstices, eclipses, or comets. The timing of this abandoned festival aligned suspiciously with a recorded volcanic eruption around 1430 CE. Some scholars think the villagers might have believed the eruption itself was part of a sacred calendar, but the strange detail was this: scattered across the plaza were tiny footprints, children's footprints preserved in the hardened ash, circling the beer jars, weaving between the instruments. They overlapped each other in dizzying patterns, as though the children had been dancing. Yet the footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the plaza, facing the direction of the mountain caves.
It was like the dancers had stepped off the stage and vanished into thin air. Investigators and anthropologists are still debating whether these prints indicate an evacuation toward the caves or whether something ritualistic took place. One theory suggests the children were led in a procession into the darkness while adults followed later. Meanwhile, a small group of local villagers who worked as laborers on the site began refusing to enter after dusk. One of them reported hearing faint drumming from beneath the ground when he walked over the plaza at night. Another swore he saw ash shifting like something was moving just below the surface. You and I know how rumors start. One eerie sound, one flicker of shadow, and suddenly a place takes on a life of its own. But when the lead archaeologist himself admitted in an interview that he sometimes felt watched while sketching the excavation at dusk, even the skeptics stopped laughing.
And there was one last unsettling find in this phase. Inside a small home at the edge of town, they found a wall painted with ochre. It showed a line of people holding hands, walking toward a mountain cave with stylized flames drawn above them. The final figure in the line was unfinished, just an outline, almost as though the painter ran out of time before they too joined the others. Remember how in Pompeii we see people frozen mid-breath, their final moments preserved? This site was the opposite. It wasn't a tragedy captured, it was an absence staged, a play without actors, a dinner without guests, a festival with no one to celebrate. And once again, we're left with questions. If they left, where did they go? Why no remains in the caves? No mass graves? No records in nearby communities? It's almost as if the village didn't just vanish into the ash, it vanished into something else entirely. The village lay quiet beneath the ash, but the mountains around it still had their secrets. By the third month of excavation, a new team arrived. Epigraphers and rock art specialists brought in after a local shepherd tipped the archaeologists off about strange markings carved into the cliffs just beyond the site. At first, the researchers assumed these would be the usual petroglyphs, common throughout the Andes, Spiro's llama's constellations scratched into the stone. Instead, what they found was unlike anything recorded in the region. Across a broad volcanic wall, just 30 meters from the edge of the town, there were crude but deliberate carvings, tall figures with arms outstretched surrounding a central flame. Beneath them were jagged lines resembling ash clouds or perhaps waves of fire. But what froze the team in their tracks were the repeated symbols underneath four angular shapes etched over and over again in neat rows. No one could translate them with certainty.
Some said they resembled a local variant of Proto-Quechua glyphs. Others claimed they were closer to runes seen in entirely different parts of the world. But one Peruvian epigrapher, Dr. Alvarez, quietly told the team that the arrangement reminded him of a phrase he'd once seen in oral tradition transcripts from highland villages: "We will return." This phrase was never written down in pre-Columbian times. It was spoken, whispered, passed along. Yet here it was gouged into rock with desperate insistence. The strange detail: the carvings looked fresh. The weathering didn't match the 15th century timeline. Some grooves were so sharp that Alvarez swore they could have been scratched within the last few decades. Investigators are still debating whether these symbols were made by the vanished villagers or whether later generations returned to mark the site. But the locals had their own interpretation. They said the Hollow Town's people hadn't died. They had walked into the mountain, become part of it, and would one day emerge again. The carvings weren't warnings, they were promises. Meanwhile, inside the excavation camp, tensions grew. One young student, flipping through her sketches at night, noticed something terrifying. In the corner of her drawing of the carvings, she had absent-mindedly traced the outlines of the tall figures with flames. But when she compared her sketch to the original wall, the next morning, there were differences. One of the figures in the rock had its head turned slightly, looking toward the village. She swore she hadn't drawn it that way. And she wasn't the only one. Several photographs taken by different team members showed the figures at slightly different angles, as though the carvings shifted when no one was watching. Now, academically, this is explained as poor lighting, shifting shadows, and subjective perception. Investigators and anthropologists are still debating whether those so-called moving carvings were real or just mass suggestion, but the rumor spread quickly through camp. The carvings were alive. One night, a watchman reported hearing a scraping sound from the cliffs, like stone grinding against stone. When he shined his flashlight, the carvings glistened as though wet, fresh dust pooling at their feet. By morning, no trace of disturbance remained. And remember the clay whistle from part one. Someone, probably bored, decided to blow it again near the cliffs. The echo that came back wasn't the same bird-like cry. It was lower, hollow, almost like a voice calling from deep within the mountain. After that, the whistle was locked away in a storage box, but the sound haunted the dig team for weeks. The town itself had been eerie enough, but now the walls around it seemed to speak. The carvings weren't background, they were an extension of the mystery, reaching out across centuries. And still there were no bodies, no burials, no answers, just four words scratched into the stone: "We will return." By the time the carvings were fully documented, the excavation team knew they weren't simply unearthing a village, they were stumbling into a story that didn't want to be told all at once. The next thread came not from the site itself, but from a dusty archive in Lima. A graduate student assisting the project had been sent to comb through 16th century missionary reports, journals written by Spanish priests who traveled through the Andes during colonization. Buried in one such document, in fading ink, was a fragment that mentioned a small settlement on the slopes of the White Mountain. Known locally as Cenizas, the priest described arriving in the region shortly after a festival of the flames.
He noted that the people of the village had disappeared, leaving behind vessels of maize beer, banners of red and black, and instruments for music, as though for a feast never eaten. The missionaries had assumed the villagers fled into the forest, but the priest added a chilling final line. The earth itself had swallowed them, and the mountains sang with voices not its own. That fragment fit perfectly with what the archaeologists were seeing in the ash, the jars, the banners, the instruments abandoned mid preparation. It seemed then that the last event in the village was a festival. But what kind of celebration ends with the disappearance of an entire community? Inside one of the larger homes, excavators found something to suggest an answer, a mural faint but still visible stretched across an interior wall. It showed a procession of villagers carrying torches, walking toward a cave mouth at the base of a mountain. Above the cave was painted a blazing sun, and surrounding it were stylized flames. Yet the villagers in the mural were not painted in normal colors. Their faces were smeared in gray and white, almost like ash. This is where history and myth start to blur. In many Andean cultures, fire was sacred, both life-giving and destructive. Rituals involving fire often mark transitions, the death of a season, the birth of a new one, the movement from one world to another. The mural suggested that the villagers weren't merely celebrating, they were enacting a ritual migration into the mountain itself. The strange detail, the mural stopped abruptly. The line of painted villagers leading toward the cave was cut off unfinished. The last few figures were only sketched outlines, as though the artist had run out of time or had to leave suddenly.
Investigators and anthropologists are still debating whether this unfinished art points to a literal evacuation into the caves during the eruption, or whether it symbolized something else, a voluntary offering, a mass ritual of disappearance. And here's where the story took an even darker turn. Inside the same home on a low shelf, they found fragments of pottery painted with geometric patterns. One shard depicted a human face with hollow eyes surrounded by flames, but under blacklight photography, the pigments revealed something almost invisible to the naked eye, faint crimson streaks, too deliberate to be random. One lab test suggested they might have been made with blood mixed into the paint. Whether the blood belonged to animals or humans remains unresolved, but the suggestion was enough to set the camp buzzing. Was the Festival of the Flames a celebration or a sacrifice? Meanwhile, local villagers who helped at the dig began refusing to carry equipment into the plaza. Some claimed they heard singing in the evenings, not the kind of eerie echoes you'd expect from wind. No, this was rhythmic, layered like a chorus of many voices chanting together. And then came the night. A storm rolled over Cerro Blanco. The archaeologists huddled in their tents as thunder cracked and rain lashed the ash. One witness later recalled hearing what sounded like drums in the distance, steady, hollow, as if echoing from inside the mountain itself. By dawn, when the storm had passed, the excavation plaza looked unchanged, but on the freshly washed ash, new footprints appeared, bare feet, adult sized, leading from the plaza toward the cave mouth. The hollow town was no longer just a dig site. It was beginning to feel like a stage where something was rehearsing its return, and the team hears those unsettling underground echoes. The decision to explore the caves wasn't taken lightly.
For weeks, the excavation team skirted around the yawning black mouth in the hillside, documenting from a distance, but never stepping inside. Locals refused to approach it altogether, calling it La Puerta de Cenizas, the Ashen Gate. But once the storm revealed the barefoot tracks leading directly toward the cave, hesitation gave way to urgency. If the vanished villagers had gone anywhere, it had to be here. A small advance group was assembled: two archaeologists, a geologist, and a local guide who reluctantly agreed to lead them as far as the entrance. They carried lamps, recorders, and a bundle of prayer beads the guide refused to let go of. The cave swallowed their light as soon as they entered. The air was warm, sulfuric, tinged with the unmistakable smell of volcanic gas.
Their footsteps stirred loose ash into the air, making every breath feel like breathing smoke. Just a few meters inside, they found the first carvings, not on the walls, but on the floor itself. Spirals, concentric circles, and what looked like footprints etched deeply into the volcanic stone. The spirals pointed inward as though drawing everything towards some central point. Deeper in the tunnel, narrowed its ceiling, dripping with mineral deposits. And then came the sound. At first, it seemed like water dripping amplified in the cavern, but when they stopped to listen, it became clear that the rhythm was too deliberate, too measured, like a slow heartbeat. The geologist suggested it was seismic activity, tiny tremors echoing through the rock, but the guide shook his head and whispered, "No, it is the drums." He refused to go further. He pressed his prayer beads into one archaeologist's hand, turned and hurried back toward daylight. The remaining three pressed on. Roughly 100 meters in their lamps illuminated something shocking, a row of niches carved into the cave wall. At first glance, they looked like tombs, but they weren't filled with bones.
They were empty, shaped like human silhouettes, as though the stone itself had once molded around living bodies that had since vanished. Each niche was just large enough to fit a person standing upright. Some bore faint traces of pigment, suggesting the figures had once been painted. This discovery electrified the team. Were these symbolic spaces for ritual, or had people truly entered them during the festival, offering themselves to the mountain? While documenting, one archaeologist brushed her hand over the inside of a niche. She yelped and pulled away. The stone wasn't cold like the rest of the cave. It was warm, almost pulsing. The geologist confirmed it. That section of rock gave off a faint vibration, like a living thing breathing beneath the surface. Investigators are still debating this. Some argue it was geothermal heat. Others believe it was psychosomatic, heightened by fear, but the recordings captured something unsettling.
In the moments after the archaeologist touched the stone, the audio picked up a low resonant hum. It rose and fell, not unlike a chant. They pressed further until the tunnel ended abruptly in a cavern. The chamber was vast, its walls slick with minerals, its ceiling jagged like teeth. At the center was a stone altar, blackened with soot. Scattered around it were remnants of offerings, broken pots, charred maize, the bones of llamas, and one other thing, a human jawbone. Unlike the animal remains, the jaw was clean intact and disturbingly recent in appearance. No carbon dating has been released publicly, but one insider later claimed it couldn't have been older than a few decades. As the team stood there in silence, lamps flickering, the heartbeat sound grew louder. Some swore they felt it vibrating in their own chests, syncing with their pulses. The hum in the recordings deepened, forming what sounded eerily like layered voices. They didn't stay long.
Fear or instinct drove them back to the entrance. When they emerged into daylight, they realized they'd been inside for nearly 5 hours. Yet to them, it had felt like less than two. The hollow town had given them its first human remains, but instead of answering questions, the caves only deepened the mystery. If the villagers had entered those niches centuries ago, where had they gone? And if the jawbone was modern, who had been there more recently? The phrase carved into the cliffs haunted every researcher as they reviewed their notes that night. We will return, and now the evidence suggested that perhaps they already had. The morning after the cave expedition, the camp was quiet, too quiet. Normally, the excavation site bustled by sunrise coffee, boiling papers, rustling students, whispering over notes. But on this day, half the tents remained zipped shut, their occupants missing. At first, no one panicked. People assumed the night shift had gone into town, maybe seeking a break from the ash-choked air. But by noon, unease set in. 3 people were unaccounted for: the archaeologist who touched the warm stone, her assistant, and one of the younger volunteers. Their tents were intact belongings, left behind bags, phones, passports. Everything. It was as though they'd walked out into the night and never returned. The local guide muttered a phrase no one wanted to hear: El regreso ha comenzado. The return has begun. Search parties scoured the slopes. Dogs were brought in. They found footprints in the ash leading toward the same cave the team had entered the day before, but these prints were fresh, unspoiled by wind. Three sets barefoot leading into darkness, none coming out. The lead investigator called it coincidence, panic playing tricks on the camp. Yet privately, he couldn't explain the detail that unsettled him most. The missing archaeologist's shoes were still neatly placed outside her tent, as if she'd deliberately removed them before leaving. Inside the cave, the searchers found nothing new. No bodies, no signs of struggle, only the same hum echoing faintly from the niches, as if the stone remembered. But when they returned to the altar chamber, they noticed the jawbone was gone. It had been there less than 24 hours earlier. Now the stone slab was bare, save for a smear of fresh ash. Back at camp, paranoia spread. Everyone slept with lights on. Recorders picked up faint noises at night, tapping like knuckles against wood, and voices that weren't quite words but carried the rhythm of chant. The strange part: these sounds were louder inside the tents than outside. That same week, a historian unearthed something chilling in a colonial archive. A missionary's diary from the early 1600s described the hollow town. He wrote of a settlement that rejected baptism instead, gathering in caverns beneath the volcano. They believed the mountain was alive, a vessel of their god. On the night of the eruption, he claimed they vanished into its belly, not screaming, but singing. The entry ended with a prophecy: they will walk the earth again when the mountain breathes. The mountain had indeed breathed in small tremors and puffs of ash the very week the modern disappearances began. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these vanishings were staged an elaborate hoax, perhaps fueled by mass hysteria, or something older, something ritualistic repeating itself. But the surviving members of the team couldn't ignore one detail. In the niches where they'd seen only emptiness before, three now bore dark stains at their base, ash disturbed as if recently stepped into. When compared to photos from the day before, the changes were undeniable. Someone or something had returned, and the camp perched so close to the Ashen Gate was next. By the end of that week, the excavation camp resembled less an academic site and more a survival outpost. Lamps burned through the night, armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and yet sleep was scarce. The three who had vanished were never found. Not a scream, not a trace, just those niches disturbed like silent invitations waiting to be filled. It was in this climate of mounting dread that the team decided to catalog every artifact recovered from the cave. Until now, most of the items had been dismissed as ceremonial pottery fragments of tools and food offerings, but under closer inspection, something else began to emerge. The first revelation came from the masks. What looked at first like hardened volcanic ash turned out under chemical analysis to be a mixture: ash blended with ground bone polished with animal fat. More disturbing still, the bone fragments weren't just animal.
At least one mask contained identifiable human collagen, and the designs, if one stared long enough, didn't seem random. Flames, spirals, stylized figures walking into an open mouth. The second discovery was a collection of stone tablets, previously overlooked as unremarkable. When cleaned, faint carvings appeared. They depicted a procession of villagers, each carrying torches, heading into the mouth of a mountain. Behind them, robed figures raised their arms as though guiding the crowd. It was the local guide who recognized the gestures, not from any textbook, but from oral traditions passed down in his family. He whispered the words he'd heard since childhood: Los hijos del fuego, children of the fire. This was no ordinary community. It had been a cult, a sect devoted entirely to fire, to ash, to the belief that the volcano was a living god that demanded sacrifice not through fear, but through devotion. The academic debate began immediately. Was this cult responsible for leading the villagers underground during the eruption? Had they staged their own disappearance? Or far more chilling, did they genuinely believe they would be transformed by the fire and return in another form? But the strangest find of all came from a bundle of charred cloth discovered in a sealed clay urn. The cloth bore stitched symbols, and when unraveled, it revealed a phrase in Quechua: "We burn, we live, we return." Those three words, burn, live, return, became the camp's obsession. One archaeologist argued the cult had embraced cyclical sacrifice, returning symbolically with each eruption. Another insisted it was literal, that the people of Hollowtown believed death was not an end, but a metamorphosis, a rebirth in fire. The debate might have remained theoretical until a night two guards swore they saw movement near the cave, not shadows, not tricks of light, figures, barefoot, cloaked in ash, walking silently toward the entrance torches, flickering in their hands. The guards fired warning shots. The figures did not flinch. Instead, they entered the cave. When the search team went in, moments later, the chamber was empty, the niches undisturbed except for one. Now four bore fresh ash at their bases. The scholars' debates were drowned out by the gnawing dread that perhaps this wasn't history repeating itself, perhaps it was simply continuing, and perhaps the children of the fire had never truly left at all. The following morning, the team gathered in a state of fragile silence. No one wanted to mention what the guards swore they had seen: ash-covered figures walking into the cave, yet the tension in the air said everything. Even the wind seemed quieter, as though the mountain itself was listening. To restore order, the director ordered a new survey of the cave system, focusing on unexplored passages. Engineers brought in ground-penetrating radar, hoping to map hidden chambers. What they found shocked everyone. Beneath the altar chamber lay a latticework of tunnels, some collapsing in on themselves, others snaking far deeper into the volcano. Excavation began. Within days, one tunnel was cleared enough for a team to squeeze through. Its walls bore claw marks, not carvings, but frantic scrapes, and scattered along the floor were bones, not whole skeletons, but fragments, fingers, toes, scraps of cloth fused with ash. It didn't look ceremonial, it looked desperate. The deeper they went, the clearer the picture became. These weren't ritual passages, they were escape routes. Someone, perhaps not everyone in Hollowtown, had followed the cult willingly. Some had tried to flee. One chamber in particular bore tragic evidence: three skeletons huddled together, arms locked, their skulls cracked by falling rock.
Nearby lay a broken clay vessel filled with half-burned maize, as if the families had carried food for the journey. Their path had collapsed before they ever reached safety. This discovery threw everything into chaos. Until now, the working theory was that the villagers had vanished by choice, led into the caves in some massive voluntary ritual, but the escape tunnel told a different story. A splinter of the population, terrified, had resisted. The implications were profound. The Hollowtown mystery was not simply a tale of devotion, it was also a story of division, neighbors, perhaps even siblings, torn apart by belief. Investigators are still debating whether the cult coerced the others or whether the mountain's eruption simply trapped both believers and dissenters alike. But the strangest find was yet to come. In the deepest chamber of the escape tunnel, researchers found a clay tablet miraculously intact. Unlike the ritual spirals seen before, this tablet carried words: "They take us, they burn us, we do not return." Unlike the cult's confident mantra of "burn, live, return," this inscription read as defiance, a warning perhaps left by those who did not believe. The team emerged shaken. If some villagers resisted, then the narrative of a united cult was false. The hollow town hadn't been erased in harmony, it had fractured violently under the shadow of fire. That night, the camp heard it again, the tapping. This time it wasn't confined to tents. It came from the mountain itself, echoing through the ground like someone knocking from within. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. The geologists insisted it was seismic stress, but the pattern, so deliberate, so human, suggested otherwise, as if those who once tried to flee were still trapped, still knocking centuries later. And in the distance, faint against the ash-filled wind, some swore they heard it again, voices singing in rhythm with the knocks, not screams, songs, just as the missionary had written 400 years earlier. The next phase of excavation turned toward the artifacts. Up until this point, most of the objects recovered from the Hollowtown ruins had been categorized as ceremonial relics, ancient masks, urns, amulets hardened in ash. But as the team laid them out beneath bright lamps, a disturbing detail emerged. The ash used to mold several masks was not fully mineralized. Its texture was softer, almost fresh, as if it hadn't endured centuries underground. Carbon testing later confirmed the worst suspicion. At least 2 masks weren't ancient at all. They were less than 50 years old, which meant someone had been carrying on the rituals long after the original villagers vanished. The masks themselves were grotesque, carved from volcanic stone and fused with ash bone paste. Each bore distorted faces with hollow eyes. Some were painted with streaks of red pigment, still vivid against the gray surface, and one mask in particular sent a shiver through the camp, a half-finished piece abandoned as if the craftsman had been interrupted. Embedded in its center was not animal bone, but a human tooth. Investigators are still debating whether this continuation of the cult was a fringe group preserving traditions, or whether it was a direct lineage, descendants of Hollowtown who never truly died. Worse still, the urns revealed traces of material that should not have survived. Human hair singed but intact, woven with strands of fiber, hair that according to lab analysis belonged to individuals no more than a few decades old. The evidence was undeniable. Hollowtown was not a mystery locked in the past. Someone had kept the fire alive, and then came the relic that changed everything. Hidden at the bottom of a collapsed storeroom was a bundle wrapped in brittle cloth. Inside lay a ceremonial knife, obsidian blade handle, carved with flame motifs, but the edge was sharp, polished, unweathered. When tested, microscopic residue revealed human blood proteins. The knife was not an artifact of centuries, it was a tool still in use. As word of this leaked, panic surged. The guards reported seeing distant torchlight on the ridges at night, always flickering, always moving, but when they approached, nothing remained. One evening, the lead archaeologist awoke to find something placed outside her tent, a small clay figure shaped crudely like a person, its head hollow, its chest filled with ash. Pinned to its base was a strip of parchment with 3 words scrawled in ash: "We return now." For the first time, the project was officially suspended. Authorities stepped in citing safety concerns, but half the team refused to leave. They were too close, they argued. They couldn't walk away from a mystery so close to breaking open. That night, the camp dogs barked furiously toward the cave. When the guards investigated, they found a new mask lying at the entrance. Unlike the others, it was painted with fresh red streaks. It was still wet, and though it was left in silence, the unspoken message rang clear. The children of the fire weren't gone. They were watching. The camp split into 2 factions almost overnight. On one side were the skeptics, seasoned researchers who insisted the recent finds must have been planted. They argued that local opportunists, emboldened by folklore, were staging a hoax to terrify the team and perhaps drive them away. Human hair, fresh paint, even the knife, everything could be fabricated, they said. a cult of scavengers, not descendants. On the other side stood those who had seen too much to dismiss, the guard who swore he'd seen torchlight on the ridge, the archaeologist who woke to find the ash-filled clay figure outside her tent, the technician who replayed the audio recordings of the caves, swearing that the hum wasn't random vibration, but layered human voices. These voices weren't centuries old, they were now. The debate grew heated. Arguments lasted deep into the night. Voices cracked tempers, flared friendships splintered. Some researchers began packing their equipment, preparing to abandon the site entirely. Others accused them of cowardice, of betraying the truth, just as they stood on the edge of revelation. And then came the most unsettling discovery yet. One morning, a graduate student reviewing aerial drone footage noticed something odd. In a sequence recorded just before dawn, the drone had captured a figure standing near the cave entrance, cloaked still and barefoot. When the footage zoomed in, the face was obscured by an ash mask. The figure held a torch that flickered briefly before extinguishing, leaving only the gray form against the black stone. No guard had reported seeing anyone that night. No footprints were found, yet the footage was real. The skeptics scrambled for explanations. A prank, a trespasser, pareidolia. But the believers pointed to a pattern. Masks, artifacts, chant sightings, each escalation mirrored the legends of Hollowtown's festival. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the cult had survived in secret all these centuries, passing down rituals from generation to generation, or whether new zealots had resurrected the old traditions in recent decades. But the argument in camp reached a breaking point. Half the team demanded evacuation. The other half insisted they venture deeper into the newly exposed tunnels, convinced answers lay further underground. The authorities wavered, caught between safety and discovery. But the decision was made for them when a tremor rattled the mountain that evening. Ash rained down across the camp. The ground pulsed like a living thing, and from deep within the cave, multiple guards swore they heard it chanting louder this time, rising and falling in waves. Some swore it was Quechua. Others heard Spanish, and one claimed it was a language older than either. But it all agreed on one thing. The voices were not distant, they were near. That night, no one slept. Lamps burned, low radios buzzed with static, and even the skeptics kept their bags close. For if the children of the fire were still alive, or worse, if they were returning, then the Hollowtown mystery was not a cold case of the past. It was unfolding in real time under their very feet. The tension in camp reached a fever pitch, and just when it seemed the project would collapse under fear and division, a discovery arrived from an unexpected source hundreds of miles away.
A historian working in Cusco, combing through colonial archives, stumbled on a fragment of parchment bound within a missionary's journal. It had been misfiled for centuries, its ink faded, its Quechua phrases barely legible. But when translated, the fragment seemed to be exactly what the excavation team had been searching for: a survivor's account. The manuscript was brief, written in hurried script, as though scratched down in panic. It told the story of a young man named Amaru who fled Hollowtown the night the mountain roared. He claimed the cult leaders, the children of the fire, had demanded that all villagers enter the caves for the night of return. Some obeyed willingly, some resisted. Those who resisted were beaten, dragged, or killed outright. Amaru escaped, with only his sister slipping through the chaos, while drums echoed from within the mountain. He wrote that the caves were filled with light like molten sun, and that the chanting shook the stone itself. His sister never made it out. She turned back, convinced their family would survive only if they joined the others. Amaru alone reached the forest beyond. He wandered for days, half starved and burned by falling ash before stumbling into a Spanish encampment. His account ends abruptly, but one chilling line stood out: "They do not burn, they walk into the fire, and they do not burn." When the team read those words aloud in camp, the effect was electric. The skeptics dismissed it as folklore, exaggerated testimony to impress missionaries, but for the believers, it was proof that the Hollowtown cult had enacted its ritual in full view of the eruption and somehow impossibly had endured. The more the team examined the fragment, the more troubling details emerged. Amaru described the cult leaders wearing masks of ash identical to those found in the cave. He spoke of an altar blackened with soot, a description that matched perfectly with the one discovered underground.
And then there was one final phrase hastily scrawled along the margin. If they return, the mountain will open again. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Amaru's testimony represents literal truth or symbolic myth. Did he truly witness villagers walk into molten fire unscathed, or was this simply the terrified imagination of a young man traumatized by catastrophe? Yet as the fragment circulated among the camp, something curious began to happen. At night, several members reported dreams of fire-lit processions. They saw themselves standing in line torches in hand masks covering their faces, moving steadily into a cavern that glowed like the sun. The strangest part, multiple people described the same dream with nearly identical details. Coincidence, shared stress hallucinations, or something older, something inherited tugging at them from the ash? That night, as the team debated the fragment by firelight, a sudden tremor rolled beneath their feet. Cups rattled, lamps flickered, and for just a moment, the mountain exhaled a plume of glowing ash into the dark sky. The hollow town had a survivor, but now, centuries later, it seemed the mountain itself was preparing to bring the rest back. By now, the line between scholarship and survival had blurred. The team lived under constant ashfall, their lungs raw, their nerves frayed. Every discovery seemed to peel back another layer of dread until what remained no longer felt like archaeology, but intrusion, like they had stumbled not onto ruins, but into something alive, something waiting. It began with the whispers. At first, only one guard mentioned it. He swore he heard voices when he stood alone at the perimeter, not distinct words, but the cadence of speech carried on the wind. His fellow guards laughed it off until they too began to hear it. Faint, murmured, always from the direction of the cave. Within days, the whispers spread. Students claimed they heard their names called while they slept. Others awoke to the sound of a crowd chanting only for the camp to be silent when they sat up. Some reported hearing music, flutes, drums, rhythms that matched the descriptions of Hollowtown's last festival. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these auditory phenomena were the result of infrasound low-frequency vibrations caused by the mountain's shifting, which are known to create auditory hallucinations. But skeptics struggled to explain one detail: why the whispers often spoke in languages the listeners did not know, yet later matched phrases found in Amaru's manuscript. The most unsettling event came during a night survey inside the cave. 3 researchers carried recording equipment deep into the niches chamber. As they set up, one heard what he described as a child humming. When they played back the audio later, the hum was unmistakable, high tuneful, rising and falling like a lullaby. But on the tape, the hum was not alone. Beneath it, layered faintly, were dozens of voices weaving together in harmony. The camp fell silent when they heard it, not because of the sound itself, but because the melody was familiar. It matched the fragment of a festival song recorded by early missionaries 4 centuries earlier, one preserved in archives, but never sung since. No one could explain how it found its way onto a modern tape. That same night, something appeared outside the campfires, shapes. At first, they seemed like heat distortions in the ash-choked air, but as the flames flickered, they took form, silhouettes of men and women standing barefoot, their faces blank, as if masked by shadow. They didn't move, didn't advance, they only watched. By dawn, the figures were gone. Fear gave way to dread, dread to inevitability. Some in the camp confessed they had begun to dream not of fleeing the mountain, but of joining the procession. They described walking into the glowing cavern without fear, feeling warmth not as pain, but as welcome. The historian who had translated Amaru's fragment put it plainly: the whispers are not memories, they are invitations. The skeptics, now a dwindling minority, argued louder than ever, desperate to anchor themselves in rationality, but their voices cracked when they too began to hear the songs. The hollow town was no longer a mystery studied from a distance. It was reaching across centuries, pulling the living toward its chorus, and one by one, the team realized something none dared say aloud: the cult had never stopped singing. It was simply waiting for more voices to join in. The morning after the whisper swept through the camp, silence hung heavy. No one spoke much at breakfast, each student and guard staring into their tin bowls, pretending not to notice how their hands trembled. The ash fell in a steady, soundless curtain outside the tents, muting the world as if the mountain itself were listening. It was the geophysicist, a woman named Dr. Ortega, who finally broke that silence. She announced that seismic scans had revealed a massive void beneath the caves, a central chamber that no one had yet entered. She traced the outlines on a crinkled survey map. The cavern stretched for hundreds of meters directly beneath the mountain's scarred summit. If the cult's legend spoke of a heart of fire where they gathered, this had to be it. The team's decision to enter was not unanimous. Some argued they should stop, pack up, and leave the place to its myths. Others insisted they had come too far. This was their chance to solve one of the Andes' greatest enigmas. Ultimately, curiosity won. It always did. The descent was brutal. A narrow shaft cut by hand centuries earlier dropped into the earth. The walls were etched with spirals and sunbursts so densely packed the stone looked alive with patterns. The deeper they went, the hotter the air became. Ash flaked from the ceiling like black snow. At last, their lanterns spilled into a vast hollow. The chamber was breathtaking and horrifying. Thousands of niches climbed the walls, each holding fragments of bone urns of ash or half-burned offerings. Charcoal still clung to the walls in dark streaks. In the center yawned a pit, wide as a plaza, glowing faintly with molten rock below. Around its edge stood stone pillars, carved with faces locked in expressions of rapture and agony, and across the chamber floor, arranged with eerie precision, were rows of stone seats, enough for hundreds. It looked less like a temple, more like a theater. As the team fanned out, their footsteps echoed unnaturally. Some swore the chamber was amplifying their breathing, turning it into a rhythm: inhale, exhale, a slow beat that seemed to sync with the rumble of the molten pit. Then someone pointed upward. High above the ceiling glittered faintly. At first they thought it was mica or quartz, but when they shone their lights, the glint resolved into countless shards of obsidian arranged like stars. In the glow of the molten pit, the shards seemed to shimmer an artificial night sky, reflecting fire instead of starlight. In that moment, the chamber was alive. A graduate student collapsed, clutching her ears. She screamed that the voices were too loud, though the others heard nothing but their own breaths. Another stumbled toward the pit arms outstretched before being dragged back at the last second. His eyes were glazed, his voice a murmur. "They're calling. They want us home." Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these breakdowns were a result of extreme heat stress, oxygen deprivation, or shared hysteria triggered by sensory overload, but some insisted what happened next had no rational explanation. The recordings, when they reviewed their field audio that night, they found something layered beneath their conversations: chanting, hundreds of voices rising and falling in unison. The melody was the same one heard in the earlier tape, the lullaby that had no right to exist in modern memory. But this time, the chant was accompanied by drumming, not imagined, not faint, the boom of instruments, echoing from a place no one had touched in centuries. And in the final minutes of the recording, the chant stopped. A single voice broke through, a woman's, whispering urgent, speaking in Quechua. One of the linguists, pale as paper, translated, "You do not belong here. Leave before you are counted among us." The warning silenced the camp.
For the first time since the expedition began, the team felt less like observers of the past and more like trespassers in a ritual that had never ended. The hollow town had given them a glimpse of its heart, and its heart had spoken back. When dawn broke, no one in the camp stirred for hours. It wasn't fatigue, it was fear and unspoken pact that as long as they stayed in their tents, the voices couldn't reach them. But hunger and duty eventually pulled them back to the cave mouth. The great chamber still waited, and with it the question none of them dared voice aloud: had they awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed? Ortega called a meeting. Her face was drawn, her tone clinical, but her hands trembled as she laid out the facts. Microseismic activity was increasing, sulfur levels in the air had spiked, and the ground temperature was climbing fast. The mountain was not sleeping, it was stirring. Then came the twist. The ancient manuscript fragments, the ones Amaru had copied in secret, mentioned the return of the fire as a blessing, not a curse. To the cult, eruption was not destruction, it was ascension. The realization sank like a stone. If the townspeople had willingly marched into the great chamber, if they had sung as ash fell and the earth roared, then their disappearance wasn't a mystery. It was a choice. The hollow town had not been lost. It had been consumed on purpose. That night, the apparitions returned. This time, they weren't distant silhouettes. They entered the camp itself, slipping between tents like smoke. Figures of men and women, their faces half burned away, their eyes glowing like embers. Some held children by the hand, some carried torches that shed no light. The guards tried to shine spotlights, but the beams passed straight through. Students screamed, some dropping to their knees, whispering the chants they had heard in their dreams.
Others covered their ears and sobbed. One apparition lingered longest. A woman cloaked in ash-stained robes, her features delicate but stern. She stopped before Dr. Ortega's tent, raised a hand, and traced a spiral in the air. Then she vanished. The spiral was the same symbol carved into every stone, every bone fragment, every pillar in the chamber. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these visions were the result of group hallucination. Skeptics argue volcanic gases can cause delirium, even shared experiences, but believers counter that the spiral traced in the air matched a symbol no one in the camp had studied closely at that point. The final straw came at dawn. The mountain shook violently enough to send ash avalanching down its slopes. A plume of smoke rose from the summit, black and furious. The air turned acrid, choking. The geophysicists declared what no one wanted to hear: an eruption was imminent, but some in the camp didn't run.
Half a dozen students, eyes vacant, began walking calmly toward the cave. Guards shouted, restrained them, dragged them back, kicking and screaming. Their voices were not their own. They chanted in Quechua words no modern student should have known. To the fire, to the heart, to the song eternal. For the first time, the expedition fractured. Some demanded evacuation. Others argued they had a duty to witness to record. A few, shaken to their core, confessed they felt the pull too, that stepping into the chamber felt not like death, but belonging. And as the ash darkened the sky, the line between past and present blurred completely. The cult's final night was repeating itself. The mountain was ready to reclaim its children, and the hollow town was ready to sing again. The ground split open beneath them, not in some subtle tremor, not in the way mountains usually groan and settle, but in a violent heave that sent tents collapsing and equipment crashing down the slopes.
The plume above the summit turned from black to fiery red, and the world lit up with an otherworldly glow. The eruption had begun. Panic tore through the camp. Some sprinted downhill, coughing through ash clouds, while others clung to their gear in futile attempts to preserve the evidence they had risked their lives to gather. Yet amid the chaos, a different procession formed. A dozen members of the expedition students' guards, even one senior archaeologist, broke away. Their faces were blank, their eyes locked on the cave mouth, their steps steady despite the quake. They walked in silence, unbothered by the falling ash, as if following a rhythm no one else could hear. The guards shouted, tried to intercept, but the procession moved with unnatural strength. Hands that had been frail minutes before shoved away armed men with terrifying force, and all the while a low chant began to rise not from their lips, but from the mountain itself.
The rest of the team, desperate and terrified, followed at a distance. They reached the great chamber just as the volcano's roar reached a crescendo. Inside, the air shimmered with heat, glowing red from the molten pit. The pillars seemed alive, their carved faces flickering in the firelight, mouths stretched wider in song, and in the seats carved into the stone, the apparitions had returned, hundreds of them, men, women, children, silent, watching, waiting. The possessed students walked to the edge of the pit. They raised their arms. Their voices joined the chant. It was then that Dr. Ortega understood. The hollow town had not vanished because of catastrophe. They had marched willingly into the fire, believing the eruption would carry them beyond death, into eternal harmony with the mountain. Their bones, their ashes, their voices had become part of this place, and now the mountain wanted more. The possessed began to step forward.
One by one, they leapt into the molten heart, their bodies consumed, instantly their voice blending with the roar. The chamber echoed with song, not screams, but rapturous singing. The rest of the team fled in horror. Some escaped down the slope, stumbling through ash as pyroclastic surges raced down the mountain. Others were never seen again, swallowed by the fire. When rescue helicopters finally reached the area, days later, the camp was gone. Only melted ruins remained. Of the 42 members of the expedition, 19 were never found. Their names are now etched into memorial plaques, but their voices, some whisper, are still heard in distorted radio static recorded by locals near the mountain. To this day, the Hollow Town is considered one of history's strangest cases of mass disappearance. Was it a cult ritual gone too far, a society crushed by geological catastrophe, or something that blurred the line between the two investigators? And detectives are still debating whether the voices recorded in the final hours of the expedition were hallucinations triggered by gases or proof that the Hollow Town's last song had never ended. The mountain sleeps again, now its slopes covered in blackened ash and silent stone, but those who live in its shadow say that sometimes on quiet nights the wind carries a melody, a low, haunting chant, the same song that swallowed a town and centuries later claimed new singers. The Hollow Town had not vanished, it had grown, and that, my friends, is where we leave the mountain smoldering in the dark, its secrets buried beneath ash once more. The Hollow Town was never just a story of a village lost. It was a warning, whispered across centuries, that some disappearances are not accidents, and some mysteries refuse to stay buried. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it, a crowd walking calmly into fire, not in panic, but in devotion. Imagine believing so strongly in a promise of eternal song that you'd let the flames take you. And now imagine the same melody weaving its way into your dreams, tugging you closer, closer until you feel the pull yourself. Was it hysteria? Was it faith? Or was it something else, a force that still waits beneath the mountain, humming softly in the molten dark? We may never know. That's the curse of mysteries like this. They don't always end in answers, only in shadows, but that's also what makes them linger. They lodge in your thoughts the way ash lingers in the lungs, and they refuse to let go. So tonight, as the world outside your window quiets and you drift towards sleep, remember that mountain, remember the voices, and if you hear faint chanting on the wind, don't listen too closely. Some songs were never meant for us.
Now, soften the lights, settle into your pillows, and let the story fade with the ash. Good night,